there's nothing else, I think we'll go right into the presentation. I'd like to introduce Paul from USGS. How are you this morning?
Very good.
Take it away.
All right. My name is Paul Heisig. I'm a hydrogeologist with the USGS Water Science Center in Troy, New York. And the study that we just got published this year for the Owasco watershed, the detailed aquifer mapping study, is part of a long-term program we have with New York State DEC, where we jointly come up with candidates for detailed aquifer mapping. And so the Owasco area has 3 communities, Moravia, Locke, and Groton, that solely use groundwater as supply. So that kind of is checks off the box for that. And then we hadn't done anything in this part of the state. So that was another reason that this was chosen. Just start by saying that USGS is a federal science agency. We're non-regulatory, so we're just doing the science. Groundwater resources or resource potential in areas around the state, which regulatory agencies, the public, whoever can use. Everything that we do is published. The data that we collect is published, so anybody can make use of it. Next slide.
Can I just check everybody can see the slides are changing and can hear okay?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
And since I assume that people probably have a relatively limited groundwater background, for the first part of the talk, I'd just like to cover some groundwater basics. So when I talk about what's going on in the Owasco watershed, you know what I'm talking about. And then at the end, have time for questions. Next. So we'll start with the hydrologic cycle. Precipitation is the ultimate source of fresh water for groundwater systems that would be of interest. When that comes down in the form of rainfall or snow, rainfall or snow melt, then can take a few different pathways once it reaches land surface. During the growing season, vegetation is up and running, and a lot of light to medium rains are going to be taken up in shallow soil by plant roots, and not much is going to infiltrate downward. If we have intense summer thunderstorm where it's coming down faster than the soil can take it in, or we have frozen conditions in the winter, frozen soil, then we're going to overland runoff that's going to go fairly quickly to streams and into streams, local lakes, any surface water body. The part of the system that I'm most interested in is that water that gets down through the soil zone and replenishes aquifers in the subsurface. This diagram shows an idealized system. Let's just say that it's all sand in this upper area that's labeled as water table aquifer. A water table aquifer can receive infiltration from rainfall, and that's going to happen. The recharge seasons are generally this time of year, mid to late fall, before ground freezes, and mid to late spring, before vegetation is fully ramping up and taking up water. So we tend to see the highest water levels groundwater levels in late fall, early winter, and in the spring. So a water table aquifer, it can receive infiltration directly from rainfall. The water doesn't just sit there. It's a dynamic system. The low point in the landscape typically is where groundwater is going to end up, serve as drains. So streams like Owasco Inlet is kind of the ultimate drain in the Owasco watershed. So it's always moving, but on the order compared to surface water, very slow. In a high gradient sand and gravel aquifer, it's feet per day. It's not anything like surface water, much slower. We have another kind of aquifer. At the bottom here is called a confined aquifer. It's defined as having a confining unit over it. It's a confining unit. So in the Owasco Inlet Valley, there are a lot of what we call lacustrine deposits, silts and clays that form a thick confining unit. And beneath that, in places, but overall fairly continuous in the subsurface, is a confined aquifer. It's not very well constrained how thick it is. It's not been used extensively. Confined aquifer can't get recharged directly from above because of the confining unit. Water moves exceedingly slow through that. So in a valley that has a confined aquifer, it's going to seep in along the edges, particularly where you have some permeable material. So I'll show some examples of this in the Owasco watershed, but these are sand and gravel deposits that go up onto the valley side and are a conduit for water to move deeper into the system. Okay, and then to complete the cycle, we have evaporation. We can have evaporation, transpiration from trees going back up. We have evaporation from surface water and from land surface. And trees can actively draw down the water table by taking up water as well. Next. So in the Owasco Inlet watershed and in general, we have two types of aquifer material. Permeable sediments, so sand and gravel, could be fine sand even in places, but this is the best kind of aquifer material because a well-sorted sand and gravel has about 30% porosity, meaning if you have a cubic foot of aquifer material, 30% of that is holding water. Whereas in bedrock, in the Owasco watershed, there's a lot of shale siltstone, not terribly permeable bedrock. So most of the groundwater exists in fractures. And those fracture zones can be few and far between. They're more common closer to land surface. And as you go deeper, you tend to have fewer fractures. So if you take a cubic foot of a bedrock aquifer, you may, if you're taking it from here, you have zero porosity. If you happen to hit a water-bearing fracture, that may account for 5% or 2% porosity compared to 30% for that. So when you draw water from a bedrock aquifer, if you draw 10 gallons of water from the sand and gravel aquifer, it's going to mine water from close to the well. It's not going to affect very far out because there's a lot of water in storage in a sand and gravel aquifer. In a bedrock aquifer, you can send a pressure wave out to draw water into a pumping well, and that can be, I've seen in some valleys 2/3 of a mile for a well pumping, say 100 gallons a minute. So very different responses to water withdrawals. But what we're most interested in the Owasco watershed, well, in the valleys, if you can get a sand gravel aquifer, that's best. In the uplands, certainly adequate for domestic supplies, and that's the kind of wells you have in the uplands. It's bedrock wells. Next. So just so you can visualize an unconsolidated or a valley fill type aquifer, here's a sand pit, and so if this was saturated, in this case, water table may be 10 feet below land surface here. But just so you can get a feel for, if you have this saturated with water, that could hold a fair amount of water. Next. So on the other hand, fractured bedrock in sedimentary rocks like we have here, you have bedding planes, and a lot of times fractures are associated with certain bedding planes. And here's a road cut. So here's a nice slice through the earth there where we can see during the winter, there's seepage coming out of a bedding plane here. And it's like time-lapse photography. It's seeping out slowly, but it freezes so you can see where the water's coming out. And so what's important to point out here is if you've got a bedrock well and you come down through here and hit this, you got a water-bearing fracture. If you're 10 feet away and you're in a part of the fracture that's holding up the overlying bedrock, the fracture's not open everywhere, it's got to support the overlying bedrock, you got nothing. So the fractured bedrock can be a little bit dicey, that you think, oh, you can get 5 gallons a minute here, and you drill another well nearby and you get less, or you have to go a lot deeper to find another water-bearing fracture. Okay. And this is just a slide of a hypothetical regional groundwater flow system. These dashed line units are the confining units, probably equivalent to something like Long Island. But just to point out that the shallow water table aquifer in the top here, if rainfall infiltrates close to the stream, it may be just a matter of days before it discharges to the stream, so it's very young groundwater. Certainly on Long Island, there's water that's over 1,000 years old that's down there that's being pumped, today. So the other thing with that is that the longer groundwater is in the system, potentially the more mineralization it picks up, and the chemistry of the water changes. So certainly water that's on the order of years and decades is going to be less dissolved solids, more palatable, and the older it gets, then you start developing issues with iron and manganese and hydrogen sulfide and things like that. Okay. Oh, let me go back one slide there. So this pattern of groundwater flow, water can flow through these confining units, but it takes a long time. So over long periods, they are somewhat permeable, but water moves very slowly through those. But you can see that the stream is the low point here. It's a drain, the local drain that drains the system. Groundwater is going to move this way. And you see this path is kind of circular like this, and you say, well, why doesn't this go like this? Well, if you're getting infiltration all the way along here, that water's got to get to the stream too. And you're converging water from a huge area to a small area. That forces it downward like that. So basically, if you put a well in here, there's an impetus to go up. So the pressure here is much higher than what it is here. So in a confined aquifer, This is an example in the Tully Valley where I have done some work, and we drilled a test well here to hit a confined aquifer, and here the water level's 15, 16 feet above land surface. In the Owasco Inlet Valley, there are reports from DOT test holes of water levels being estimated to be as much as 100 feet above land surface back in the 1950s. I don't know if that holds for today because things do change, you have more development. But so a water table well here would be 5 feet below land surface. So there's a big gradient for water, or water wants to move up if it can. It's under pressure. Okay. So let's talk about the Owasco Inlet Valley. This is probably about what it looked like 15 to 17,000 years ago. The area has been glaciated. The retreat of the ice sheet was about during that time interval in the Owasco Inlet area. And what I'd like to point out here is along the shoreline here, along the side of the valley, there's some coarse gravels. And there's a proglacial lake here, and you can see it's turbid. And so in the lake environment, you have the silt and fine sand settling out, which is will become your confining units. And this is what we call ice contact, sand and gravel. And this is potentially your aquifer or permeable material along the side of the valley that can move downward and supply a confined aquifer. Okay. So with the advent of LiDAR imagery, super high resolution land surface elevation data, you can look at hill shades of that, and you can see fine details. You can see stone walls, furrows in farm fields. So in this area, this is the Owasco watershed. These red dashed lines are traces of moraines in the upland. And so moraine is where the ice stopped for a little while and paused during retreat, and sediment accumulates at the edge of the ice in the uplands. In the valleys, we tend to get if the ice pauses, there's concentrated, more coarse-grained deposits form. So in these places, like at Groton, that was a location where the ice stopped for a while. This is halfway between Groton and Locke. There's a gravel pit on the valley wall there. That's another location. There's some indications here. So that's important in terms of water resources. And just to give you an idea what the ice looked like as it was retreating from this area. Can you hit the next? So here's one of these moraines, and you can see there's a major ice tongue that came down the Cayuga and Seneca valleys. That was where the ice was thickest, and it actually kind of swept across this way the last ice advance. So that's just a snapshot in time as the ice was retreating. Next. So after the ice retreats, we're left with glacial deposits at land surface, cover most of land surface. And this is just an example from near where I live. And the blues and the light purple and light pink are all relatively, mostly glacial till, fairly impermeable. That's an unsorted mixture of all sorts of different rock sizes, particle sizes. Where you have the pink and the orangish and darker yellow and darker orange, that's more permeable deposits. So that's basically what I did in the Owasco watershed. Okay, next. So this is kind of an overview map. There's a big plate in the report, and I didn't put the link online, but if you Google Owasco and my last name and USGS,
I sent it out.
Yeah, okay, good.
before the meeting.
It pops up. So there's a big plate associated with that has much more detail. This is just an overview of the area, and pink is glacial till in the uplands. In the valleys, you'll see occasionally some areas of the more orangish, and those are more permeable deposits. But this just shows what's at land surface. So in the valley, you see alluvium and you see some lacustrine deposits, but you don't really see what's beneath. So these dark lines represent geologic sections where I have well data that I basically, I'm looking at the earth, taking a slice and showing you depth to bedrock and what kind of deposits are there. Okay, next. Oh, so the first one is the long section. That's okay. This is the long section. So from south in Freeville, Groton, Locke, Moravia, and then the flatlands before you hit Owasco Lake. And gray is bedrock. And so we have well data. Wells don't generally hit bedrock in the valley. Drillers go down through the green are lacustrine deposits. So you can see predominantly fine-grained deposits in this valley. So you can't just sink a shallow, in most places, you can't sink a shallow well and get water. You need to go deeper. So orange is sand and gravel, yellow is sand. So what I'd like to point out at the bottom is that where we do have information, many wells are completed in sand and gravel above bedrock. Drillers drill through the lacustrine deposits. They hit the sand and gravel. They get gallons, many gallons per minute water. They don't need to drill any farther, so we don't really know what the depth to bedrock was. So I made a series of seismic measurements, these little green dash lines here to supplement. So that gives us an estimate of the bedrock surface there. And so the indications are that there's this confined aquifer, relatively thin in a number of places, but again, it's poorly constrained. But I'd say that there's this confined aquifer, more or less continuous, probably goes under Owasco Lake. There's been seismic data on Owasco Lake that suggests that these things continue. So let's see. The other thing I wanted to point out here is these pale orange locations are sand and gravel that's up on the valley wall. So these are those places where the ice paused for a while. And so those are potential places where water can get into deeper aquifers. They're frequently gravel pits. A problem historically has been gravel pit gets mined out and you have this space, and what do you do with it? Well, let's put a landfill there, or let's, in the case of Groton, which I'll show an example, they've stored road salt there. And I'll show you what some of the implications of that are. These deposits, We have no subsurface information, so we don't know how well they connect or if there's permeable materials to connect to there. But in general, these are pretty sensitive areas. So you don't want to be making land use decisions that potentially have some sort of leachate or something that could affect groundwater quality. Next. So this is just a close-up in the area around Groton. Groton is kind of the exception. There's a pause in the ice here, and you can see there's a big rise in bedrock here, so that may have something to do with, the ice being stuck there for a while. There's two supply wells in Groton in the valley deposits. There are some fine grain units here, but there's a lot of sand and gravel in this area. So this is potentially a place for recharge to get into the deeper aquifer, or certainly can go to these wells here. Okay. So here's a cross section across the valley at Groton. Here's the same supply well right here, two supply wells here. Here's on the west side, I guess it is. This is what's been mined out, at least close by. There's more gravel pits here, and this is where road salt stockpile is. So when I was doing seismic measurements, I needed to make a measurement up there. I got permission to make the measurement, and I noticed that they had the salt stockpile there. And I looked at some water chemistry from this well, and the sodium was way high. They didn't measure chloride in the analysis that I saw, but way higher than you would expect naturally in this area. So what I think is that you have a leachate source here, permeable material, and a withdrawal point that's withdrawing water. And so you're bringing that leachate down to the well field. So I suggested that they find another place for their road salt storage to enhance this. What they do is blend water with another source, so it brings their sodium and chloride concentrations down. Our office has since, as part of a statewide groundwater sampling program, sampled one of those wells, and so there's a much more complete analysis, and yeah, chloride is high too as well. So that's a cautionary tale in terms of why it's important to be aware of. You have these kind of features on the valley wall, and you don't want to do something that could provide a source of leachate, source of contamination to groundwater. Next. Here's that salt pile, and to boot, it's uncovered, which is not a good practice. Next. So here's a cross section near Block, and Tom, you're on the line. This is one of the towns. Where it indicates flowing. This is one of the town's supply wells. There are two town supply wells, and I found a well log for that well, and so it's got clay, some fine sand, some gravelly till, which is your clay gravel, and then at the base they hit a sand and gravel unit. There's a DOT test well that was drilled in the 1955, and this is where they estimated the water level was greater than 100 feet. I don't know whether that's the case now, but Certainly, there's potential in the confined aquifer beneath all these lake deposits in not just the lock area, pretty much throughout the Owasco Inlet Valley. There's definitely records of domestic wells that have been drilled in the valley, and they have to be capped, watertight capped, because I've heard tales of drillers, losing control of these wells, and they have to bring in, I think, extra help to get them sealed. So there's definitely potential down there. I guess just the other part of that is confined aquifer in general. If you're not affected by a recharge area on the side, you could have a road salt pile sitting up here, and the chance of that affecting anything below are next to nothing. Confined aquifer is more protected than an unconfined aquifer. Okay. We'll just go down to Moravia. It's a similar situation, although there's a big alluvial fans in Moravia, so that's a kind of a fan-shaped deposit where a large tributary comes in. So that's from Decker and Dresserville creeks, and as soon as the ice was out of the area, that upland area had probably a lot of unstable sediments, and probably a lot of that, some of the fan deposits may be interbedded with the Green Lake deposits. And in fact, the Moravia's well field, the wells are only 30, 35 feet deep. And so they're tapping probably something related either to the alluvial fan or when lake levels were a little bit lower. And that may be connected to Owasco Inlet. So that's another potential source of water, is when you have a shallow well intersecting a permeable deposit that's in connection with a local creek. Typically, groundwater wants to flow towards the creek, and in this case, where you're withdrawing water near a stream, you can reverse groundwater flow, and groundwater will flow from the creek into the aquifer. So that's another, and that Moravia supply, I think it's the most productive of the supply wells that I've seen in the Owasco Inlet, hundreds of gallons a minute. That said, though, if you look beneath these lacustrine confining unit here, there likely is sand and gravel at greater depth in Moravia, just like in Locke. So if for some reason there are issues with the shallow supply, they potentially have a deeper supply available to them. Okay.
Can everybody online still see? We lost it for a second. Okay.
So this slide is kind of an overall compilation of what I found in the area based on well logs, just showing different types of aquifers or confining units over potential aquifers. So in the main Owasco Inlet Valley, this green, light green is confined by potential aquifer, confined by lacustrine, silt and clay. At Groton, it's more of a unconfined or semi-confined. There's a little bit of confinement there, but that's a relatively unconfined area within the valley. To the north, we have lacustrine deposits confining, and on top of that, there's a thin layer of glacial till. So there was a glacial re-advance that covered or reworked the lake deposits that's been identified in that area. Bottom line is it's confined here, it's confined here, probably semi-confined here. There's confined aquifer in this section of Dresserville Creek, and the confluence of Decker Creek and Dresserville Creek has potential, certainly going up Decker Creek a little ways, because it's a fairly short creek, but near the confluence with Dresserville Creek, there's, I think it's been reported, like 70 feet of sand and gravel. So if that had 20 feet of saturated sand and gravel, that's potentially could be a productive aquifer, and it could induce infiltration from Decker Creek as well to supplement. So, there's some potential there. There's some potential in Dresserville. At Moravia, there's a delta deposit here. This glacial lake was a couple hundred feet high. So there's delta deposits and gravel pits there, but they're all basically high and dry. So they're potentially a place where recharge can get in and maybe get under this confining unit, but those units themselves, lots of sand and gravel, but it's unsaturated, so it's not, you wouldn't consider it an aquifer. In a couple areas up here, there are indications of there's sand and gravel beneath till in these well logs. Because they're small areas and it's mostly covered by till, it would make me, I would think it's probably fine for domestic supply, but municipal supply, you kind of need to have some source of recharge. And if it's mostly till up here, there's no window for water to get in quickly. It's probably not sustainable for anything larger than 10 or 20 gallons a minute. Yeah, it would have to be tested. But these areas I wouldn't get excited about, but I documented them because there's definitely sand and gravel there beneath glacial till. A couple other areas like that. Hemlock Creek has some sand and gravel in it, but it's very thin, so I wouldn't consider it has much potential there. Okay, so then just to kind of sum things up, and this is a conceptual block diagram of kind of within the Owasco Inlet Valley. The lacustrine silts and clays are very thick, and in places they're up on the valley walls and they've been eroded. Also pretty impermeable, so it's potential that groundwater in the fractured bedrock is going to move down the hillsides. So that's a potential source of recharge to confined aquifers at depth. There's not really a good water table aquifer here. There's it's alluvium, recent stream deposits on top of these lake deposits. And alluvium, you can have some gravelly zones, but in general, floodplain deposits are going to be on the finer grain side. So not a necessarily good aquifer there. Although where you have a big alluvial fan like Moravia, the first slide I showed was wells at some sort of mini mart across from Fillmore Glen. And so Fillmore Glen has its own alluvial fan there, and I don't know why there are two wells there, but I think they're less than 100 feet deep, and so probably making use of some of the coarser zones in the earlier development of inflow of water from that stream. And then you can have a semi-confined, sometimes the base of alluvium is coarse, or if you have alluvial material that can move out into be deposited within the lake deposits, that's probably what Moravia has as their source. And then where you have sand and gravel on the valley walls, that's again potential source of recharge to the deeper aquifers. Okay. So I'll stop there. Hopefully that gives you a good overview. If you have questions, I'm happy to try to answer.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. There's a lot of data there. Is there comparative data from other Finger Lakes valleys out there? Because as you look at that section, particularly from Moravia down south, you're really talking about a relatively narrow window where all of that recharge to the confined aquifer is going to happen. So is that indicative? Is it usually that small of a percentage of the land mass that does that? Or
well, it's typical. Actually, if could we go back to a slide? That long green section early in the. So these all the Finger Lake valleys.
Which
As,
one?
Go down a bit. Yeah, that one. So most Finger Lake valleys they flow northward. So as the ice retreated, flow to the south was limited. So you always had a lake there. So all the Finger Lakes have thick confining units. Ithaca historically had a number of supply wells that were drilled down through confining units, and it was a good supply for a while. I'm not sure if those were abandoned in favor of a reservoir or something at some point, but that's fairly typical of Finger Lakes valleys because they're all want to flow south. The ice was blocking flow, so you always had some sort of lake at various levels, depending on where there was an outflow point. So yeah, it's typical. The Tully Valley were, same thing. Lots of silt and clay and some very highly pressurized confined aquifers.
I just had a question for clarification. You talk about the pressurized aquifers and then you were showing the pool. You mean that from that well, that water pressure went up that distance because there was no confinement in that area?
Right. It's saying that well is seeing the pressure at depth in that sand and gravel unit, and it is way higher than land surface.
All right.
So you're poking a hole into like a balloon almost, and
it goes up.
it's telling you that's the pressure in that deep aquifer.
So is that also a term called artesian well?
Yeah.
Okay. I had a question also, it wasn't mentioned, about eskers.
Yes.
Now, to me, an esker is like an underground lake. Am I correct geologically when you think about how the glaciers work? And do we have any?
Yeah, so eskers are generally coarse sand and gravel deposits that are deposited by meltwater either under the glacier, so it's like a stream under the glacier, high pressure stream, could be within the glacier or even on top of the glacier, and the glacier melts, and if there's no, things are stagnant, yeah, you can get these sinuous snake-like deposits of gravel.
if they're at the base of the valley, and that confined aquifer here, some of that may be esker deposits. It's one, so it's not an underground river, but it's a sinuous sand and gravel deposit, and where it's saturated, it's going to be should be very permeable. So good aquifer material. In many places, if you see an esker at land surface, which you do, it's generally high and dry. So there's a sequence. So say an esker, there's bedrock, glaciation, you might have a little glacial till, then you have the ice retreating and meltwater creating an esker. And then if you have a lake, then it's buried under those. If there's no lake forming as the ice retreats, then you just see it at land surface. And they're very interesting features to, on the LiDAR, they stand out. So eskers can be good aquifers. If you see them at land surface, they're generally above the water table, so they're unsaturated. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions out there? Any questions online?
I might have one.
Okay.
How do we differ from California? Is there any difference as far as groundwater?
California?
Yeah.
Most of California outside the Sierras has not been glaciated. So the deposits there, like in the Central Valley, that's mostly stream deposits, alluvium from the Sierras that's come down. So that's like a continuous alluvial fan from the Sierras. So they've been uplifting erosion. So a lot of those deposits are kind of alluvial fan deposits, which can be pretty permeable if there's just naturally basins. Like California is tectonically very active, so things are getting squished and you have faulting going on, and so the Central Valley is kind of a closed basin. So periodically it's had lakes in there, then you have fine grain deposits if you have a lake. So you can have, deposits in general are going to be, it's the same principles, it's just a different origin for the deposits. In the Sierras, you can have valleys, something like this, I'm sure.
Other questions?
Darby, go ahead.
Hello, this is Darby from Tompkins County. I've been working with the USGS on another aquifer study in
Yes.
the lower Falk Valley. So yeah, we don't quite get into the Cayuga County. And just so other folks know, in Tompkins County, we've had about a 25 year program, cooperative program with USGS, and we've done about 10 aquifer studies, maybe a couple less than that over the year. So, have been doing these very similar studies across the county. But my question for you, Paul, is about how receptive Groton was to moving their salt pile, and thoughts from folks on if they needed grant funding. I know there's some salt storage grants out there. Is that something that would be eligible? Because it seems like there is a shown an issue with the water quality, right?
Well, so I talked to the water superintendent at the time and made the suggestion that, if it could be moved from the gravel pit to maybe near where their sewage treatment plant is on the bottom of the valley, that would be less groundwater would be affected. If there's any leachate, it would move toward the stream, but then there'd be a lot more dilution. I think that, so, and after that, we did follow up when the 305B program, which samples groundwater across New York State, was doing the Finger Lakes area. I suggested that they sample, which for free, Groton's well, and they agreed. And so there is a complete analysis, a pretty comprehensive analysis of that groundwater sample online, and certainly available. So I don't know as they acted on that. Like I said, they have this other unique water source, this infiltration gallery up in the uplands, where there's some sand and gravel, thin sand and gravel, and that's gravity fed to the village, and that's very low dissolved solids. And so they blend that to bring the concentration down. But certainly, if it would be nice if that well source was usable on its own, but I don't know if anything has happened.
Okay, thanks.
Any others online? Michelle?
Anybody else online?
Okay. I'm sure Michelle will send out maybe a link to the presentation or at least contact information. Paul, we really appreciate that time. I think that's a really deep dive into the aquifer that we have here. So we really appreciate the information.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.